My name is Ben. I am developer advocate here at Puppet, working on the community team. This is
Hey, my name is Reed Vanderwill. I'm a solutions architect at Puppet. Been using Puppet for like 8 years now, if you count before I joined Puppet. So it's been a long time.
Fun fact: my the first training that I delivered here at Puppet was actually one that Reed organized for a group that he was coordinating before he came here.
Crazy.
And charter members of the Five Room Five Fingers Club.
This is true.
The co-president.
Yeah.
The shoes.
Yeah. We had a new hire yesterday. She was wearing hers. Did you catch that?
Oh, good.
It's my turn. Hi, I'm Lindsay Smith. I'm a product manager. I work in the ecosystem group. Includes the Puppet Forge, the PDK, integrations with partners, the new secrets integration, which is super awesome. You should all try it.
And I'm Anna Velasco on the community team, associate community manager, and I work with contributor events, Puppet user groups, and evangelism.
Anna has wrangled us all together here in this one space. Suppose we can go ahead and get started. We were talking about this a little bit earlier today, and kind of the question came up is like, what is actually the value of product or project management when you're doing a small project, like a personal project, open source, toy project, side project, whatever you want to call it. It's a lot of people like have that sort of visceral, oh God, I don't want to do that reaction to project management. And Lindsay said, well, I think the question you should be asking yourself is, do you want more contributors to your project, or do you want more people using your project? And I think that's a real good way of thinking about it. Mm-hmm. So we were going to do sort of like a little bit of a round table, a conversation. Lindsay has a lot of information for us. I have a lot of questions for him, and we'll just go ahead and get started. What do you do as kind of your role here? What's your experience?
So as I said, I'm a product manager. And in the sort of idealized sense, our job is to pick what problems we want to solve, and by extension, like who we were solving those problems for. If you think back maybe to the early days of Puppet, it was, Luke was solving his he was the audience. He was solving his problems, and he was a sysadmin, but there happened to be, tens of thousands of people in virtually exactly the same position as him. And so, he was solving a problem for people just like him. But I think, fast forwarding many years, we've learned a lot about that. And Puppet's a much bigger company. We have multiple products. And so having a strong sense of who your customer is and what are the problems that you need to solve, I think is super important. And I'm using words like customer and problem, which are probably a little highfalutin for maybe if you've just got like a very small, side project or a module or whatever. But I think it's a productive way to think about it. And like when Ben and I were talking about this morning, like an example was like, okay, maybe you have a module or something about, I want a simplified version of something. I want to make it easy for people that are not super familiar with some technology to manage it with Puppet. And you kind of go down that line. Then like later on, you're kind of in the middle of the code. You're like, hey, I wonder, I could do this. There's 7 different ways you could do this. Or I want to add a bunch of options because I super know this technology really, really well, and I need every knob. I need every knob and dial accessible to me. So, but if you kind of like, map where you are in that moment back to like, well, who am I building this for? Is it if it is the beginner, like, do they really need 47 knobs and dials? Maybe not. And then you could say, okay, well, maybe I'll go about this in a different way. Or you could say, look, I'm sorry, this is not for beginners. You really need to know, multi-node replicated Postgres. You must be this tall to ride this ride. Like if you're upfront about that, then you can expose like maximum knobs and dials and make assumptions about what your audience knows. But, kind of figuring that out ahead of time and being explicit, I think will help make some decisions down the line easier.
That's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. I remember a module that I wrote years ago. It was just managing Drupal, which is content management system. And Drupal itself is pretty simple. It's a web app. So really all it needs is some kind of web server and some kind of database and some kind of PHP backend. And actually, I guess it's not really all that simple. There are decisions that go into like how much of it you manage. Like if I'm writing a module to manage Drupal, do I also like create the database? If so, which database am I going to choose? Am I going to be using MySQL? What if my user is using Postgres? There are a lot of questions that come into play. Or do I just like step back and I just say, I'm not managing any of that. I'm leaving that up to you to manage. And then there's like that expectation of, like you said, you must be this high to use this module. So how do you go about answering some of those questions? Or
I mean, I think you need to figure that out for yourself. As you talked about that, I thought back to my sad history as a sysadmin. I used to run our mail server, and I remember like finding like the holy grail was just type these things in and postfix will work, right? Because postfix is super complicated with a million knobs, and I just like, please tell me what to type to make this thing work. And like what I really wanted was like this is a 0 or 1 or 2 knob process. Like, I'm not going to teach you how to configure anything. You got to assume you have to choose all of my assumptions. But if you do 1, 2, 3, it will work, right? And so, maybe if this is coming out of your own problem, you can kind of think about this as like, did you encounter this problem because you were working with an unfamiliar technology? Then if so, maybe you should make an opinionated lower number of knobs. But if you are an expert in some technology, and maybe you've been onboarding teammates and you really understand what it is to take someone who is not familiar with the technology to become conversant enough to work with it every day. Maybe you could make a module that is meant for, look, I'm going to choose some defaults based on my experience. Or you actually could go either way. You could make the prescriptive version based on your experience, or you could make the all knobs and dials version because you really understand what those knobs and dials, are.
I think there's a little bit there as far as how many knobs and dials you're exposed to, whether you're talking about trying to adapt or trying to provide a tool that somebody who has a long history of using a technology can adapt to their instantiation of it, versus what we call greenfield, which is kind of what you're describing with the postfix, where I just want it to work. I'm not necessarily an expert, and I'm happy to be given a prescription for how it should be deployed, and just run with that to begin with.
Yeah.
Of course, that requires, if you're writing that module, if you're writing a postfix module, for example, that you need to be the person giving, or you need to know what the right way to use it is.
Yeah. Right.
Because if you write a module that does it the wrong way, then.
Yeah.
And I think like now I've been using Puppet for long enough, and I'm familiar with like all the different development patterns. And if I were to write that module today, I would be very prescriptive about what I am managing and what I'm not managing, and say this thing is managing Drupal. Here are some examples of how you can incorporate that into your own roles and profiles, and leave that to somebody else. I might at this point though develop like some example profiles. If you wanted to do this as a LAMP stack, here is an example profile to use. If you wanted to do this in like a Microsoft SQL Server, here is probably a little bit more complex profile to set this up. But then each one of those takes time to develop. And if I just do that ad hoc, if I just like think, oh, hey, maybe I want to try my Microsoft SQL Server this day, I'm never going to get to that point where I'm like making a release. So how do you prioritize getting something out, like getting your MVP done, getting your proof of concept, like putting milestones in your roadmap to get something delivered?
That's a great question, and something that I think we kind of have to wrangle with all the time. Yeah, I think it probably comes down to personal preference, but I would say shade towards releasing sooner rather than later, because there's always like, well, it just needs one more feature, or it's just not quite polished enough. But if you have a sense of like, okay, the main problem for this thing to solve is X, and it actually does solve X, well, then you're in striking distance. Maybe you do a little more cleanup, or there maybe is a little bit of polish that it needs, so that it works more than on your laptop or in your bespoke environment. But again, I would kind of map back to like, okay, what is the main problem I need to solve? Is there some sort of path that gets me to a solution? And then you're probably really close. You could decide like just how rough it is. But generally, I think we all favor you ship it earlier. If you can actually solve a problem, well, you should get it out there so that people know that this thing exists, and then they can use it. They can give you feedback. And it's like, yeah, I knew that. I need to do that. I need to make this configurable or whatever, or I need a better example. Or maybe they tell you something you didn't know. You're like, okay, well, you learned that sooner. You did less work and you got the feedback sooner.
Kind of sounds like maybe you're describing a little bit of like what Semver is teaching us, where you break things down into a major break and release, a new feature update, and then I'm just fixing things, releases.
Yeah.
Do you, when you're putting together a smaller project, do you lay out what your kind of milestones are in Semver?
I guess it depends on how confident you are in the problem and your solution. Yeah, I think it would kind of rest on that. Like if you really have a good understanding about what I'm going to need to do these three things in this order, and then when I have done those three things, it will be, it will solve a problem. Like you could probably do that. I would say probably in, an arbitrary world, you probably don't have that much clarity. Maybe I can give you an example. So like I said, I worked on the Puppet development kit, and we knew, we had exactly that question, right? It's like, when can we ship it? Like when can we open the repo? We knew it was going to be open source, but it was a question of, one was, when could we open the repo? When could we tell people about this? And when could we actually recommend that kind of everyday people use it, right? We knew power users, we knew a Ben or a Reed could pick this thing up and kind of like wrap their heads around it when it was very, very rough, but that's probably not everybody. And so we had those questions. And I think that where we kind of came around was, okay, let's have it do something, even if it's not the most valuable thing in the world, but there was something tangible that we could point to. Then we opened the repo and we told a few people, this exists. We're working on these kind of problems. Come and look at this. It doesn't do a lot, but just be aware that it exists and it's moving forward. And then the next set of decisions were sort of like, okay, what are the things that it needs to be able to do to get to a place where we could actually recommend this to, because PDK is sort of, it's intended for everyone, but it is it has a lot of value for a relatively new Puppet, and a relative newcomer to Puppet. So, and again, we knew who our user was. We knew that the Reeds and the Bins of the world were going to, like, well, how do I get the bundler, right? You knew where you needed to know where all the knobs and dials were, but, we knew that we wanted to make this super accessible for people. So, we would always think back, okay, who is that person that's pretty unfamiliar? Let's make decisions geared towards them. And so we kind of use that to, okay, it needs to be able to do X, Y, and Z. But when it does X, Y, and Z, it still doesn't do a ton, but it does something. And then that's when we started to announce it. But this was kind of back to your Semver point. This was 0.2, right? And then we had another set of conversations about what makes this a 1.0. Like 1.0 is sort of like, we take all comers. Like we're pretty confident in the capability and the quality and documentation, all that stuff. Like, so we had a second set of okay, 0.2 does a thing. Not a lot of things, but does a thing, has a lot of limitations, won't bite you in the behind immediately, but, not something you could just unleash on the world. And then we had to go through that again.
Yeah, I want to comment on something I think is a really good design characteristic of where the PDK landed, and it didn't get there in your first release. It was like a few pieces in.
Yeah.
Is the PDK provides a very clear prescriptive, I'll call it like a secluded garden of these are the things that we curate and you can do and we prescribe you can do, and it's a set path. And then it has a clear gate that leads out of it. There's a way, it's like a pressure relief valve, I usually call these things, where in this case it's PDK bundle exec, where if you want to do something outside of this garden, we have a clear interface for that, and you can use it for more powerful things. Yeah. But there's a clear gate. It's you're outside now.
Yeah, and we tried to be upfront about that. Like, this exists. You should only use it if you know what you're doing. And that's also true of the template as well, because we knew we knew that people were going to want to like mess with the template. And so we're like, again, it's like, okay, you can mess with the template, but again, we tried to be really clear about this. It's like, if you do this, you're accepting these constraints.
Yeah. And I kind of consider that like a less is more kind of design decision. It's here's what we prescribe. But we're making some intentional decisions and things we're not doing, but we're still providing power users that way out of things.
Yeah. And I think, I appreciate your recognition of that, because like we try to think about those things. We try to. There was sort of an expression. What is it? Make the hard things easy, and
easy things possible?
The easy. I can't remember, but it's like maybe they make the hard thing easy and the
impossible things possible.
Possible, yeah.
So that's actually that's an interesting point too, because I remember I was involved in some of these conversations when the PDK was being built, and I was on the other side. I was like that rabble rouser saying, "Why doesn't it do this?" How do you deal with people who are asking for that?
How do you say no?
Yeah, exactly. How do you say no?
No,
and maybe that's a more succinct way of phrasing the question is, here's 9,000 features that your project could have, millions of things that you could do. Yeah. How do you decide what you're going to do now and what you're going to do tomorrow and what you're going to do someday?
Or not do?
No, it's like if you have a sense of who your customer is, which you can totally be wrong about. Like I think for the PDK, we largely got it right. But you could all of our hypotheses could be totally wrong. Right. And then, you're right in the moment, but wrong in the long term. But I think we had a good sense of who the customers are, and we were really upfront about that. These types of conversations with developers and other people on many, many projects, different companies, there's a strong urge to build. I know what I need to build. I want to go build it. Right. Why are we talking about people? Like, this is not about people. This is about me building the thing. I want to go build the thing, and you're stopping me from building the thing. And that can be really uncomfortable where like, okay, I want to get you building the thing as quickly as possible, but I also want you to build the right thing or have a better chance of building the right thing. So let's take a minute. Let's try to have a shared understanding about who this is for. We'll write it down. And for PDK, I remember writing these docs. I remember sending them to you. It's like in big bold type. Like, this is for the beginners, right? And I think, eventually people got on board with that, and that we stuck to that. And kind of your point, like, yeah, it's easy for the beginners. It's prescriptive. There's a way out if you know what you're doing. But we got to that place because we sat down in a room like this and we talked a lot and kind of got to the point where like, okay, I understand who this is for. And then you can make those sort of like implementation and design decisions. Or it's easier. You have more guardrail. If you take that 7 million item long list of potential features, and then you can really start to sort like, okay, beginner's never going to need that. This will actually can make it worse for the beginner. Okay, these are the things.
So the thing you're highlighting is basically just making sure that everybody who's either contributing or building has a shared understanding of who we're building this for.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think a lot of people have this idea that project management or product management or anything is a very waterfall process. I'm sitting here and I design what I'm going to do, and then I go do that, and then I'm done. And it sounds to me like you're not talking about that at all. What you're talking about is just understand who you're building for. Mm-hmm. And that means that even as you plan things out, you can still be agile and go back and maybe abandon a certain line of thought and move on to another line of thought if it doesn't pan out.
Yeah.
But it means you can be very iterative and still think about where you're going as long as you pay attention to who you're building for.
Yeah. And it's not to say that upfront building is wrong. You may need to prove that you can even do it, or maybe your idea to open source some project is based on your lived reality at work, and you already know it's a problem because you have it, and you want to share that, that whatever you've built with the world, like, that none of that is wrong, but again, like kind of having a good think about who is this for, and maybe kind of put this in practical terms where. Something I love to see on any, module or any repo is, this module solves X and is for Y, right? This module is for running, a simple Drupal installation with Postgres 9, right? With whatever it is, like whatever the constraints are. Like, and you can just, because there's probably 50 Drupal modules, right? You're like, which one? You just, I mean, I'm sure everybody, we all kind of do the same thing. You're like, oh, this one has 8 million downloads. This one has 7.
Yeah.
We're going to go with the one with 8 million. But how do you know it's right? If you can just write that down up at the top, this is for this
target
X
audience. Yeah.
for Y. Just like put it in a sentence, put it at the top. That is like 1,000,000% improvement. I think over a lot of, the flip side is like the repos. It's like, this is I don't know, it's like, it's when they mention the language, this is not, maybe because we're talking about Puppet, everything's written in Puppet, but if you look at these repos, it's like they talk about, this is written in Node, something like that. It's like, it's kind of, I don't care if it's written in Node. If it solves my problem and it's the good fit for me, I love that, but I don't care. You ever see a tool comparison?
No, and I think that the point there isn't so much whether it's written in Node or whether it's written in Rust or whether it's written in Ruby. I think the point there is like the barrier to entry.
Yeah.
And sometimes the language choice or the framework choice comes into play there, and sometimes it doesn't. But I just want to know how hard is it going to be for me to pick this up? How hard is it going to be to do something useful with it?
Yeah. A great thing would be providing a working example. This snippet of Puppet code will give you Drupal. Like if, give me the address, the host name of your Postgres 9 database, Postgres 9 and only Postgres 9, whatever. I don't know what Postgres versions are now, but whatever that is. Ben's cool Drupal module for Postgres 10. Like,
I think it was Postgres 7 at the time. It's a very old module. I don't recommend using it, by the way.
There are probably 49 other Drupal modules.
Kind of coming back to what we were talking about earlier is do you want more contributors or more users? Is that if you start prioritizing work to do now and work to do later, that also lets you kind of curate this roadmap. And it doesn't have to be like we are going to be there on December 23rd or whatever. But if you have an idea of things that you want to happen, things you want your module to do, it seems like it makes it a lot easier for somebody to come in and look at that and go, oh, I can help out with that. Do you have like suggestions on how to sort of curate this list or how to make your project more appealing to getting people involved to helping out?
There's a lot of ways you could approach that question. Some of them is like, how do you keep a list of ideas? Mm-hmm. You probably maybe just have like a text file and it's got a bunch of ideas, but then you can kind of periodically kind of go back and sift through them. You do like a rough sort, like this is, maybe approach it the same way if someone sends you a PR. You're like, okay, well, the code is fine, but do I really want it to do this thing? Right? It's adding a capability, and maybe you're like, I've always wanted it to do this, and you're like, yeah, and you're super glad. And then another one's like, this is not really what this is for. Like, it's maybe like a weird add-on, or it just seems to be taking in a different direction that you, maybe if you're the maintainer that you kind of want it to, you can kind of do that same thing with a list of things.
I was going to comment too, at least looking at the Puppet project, there's several different kind of it's called kinds of contributors. And Puppet mostly has people who are users of the tool, and the contributions that they submit are not necessarily informed by the tool's roadmap, but they are because the user has found a problem and they pulled their hair out at it for a while, and eventually they've created a little bit of code that fixes it, and then they submit that back to the project.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's in the form of a bug fix. Sometimes that's in the form of what looks like a feature, which is kind of going into where you're saying, is it going in the right direction?
Yeah.
And at least in the case of Puppet, infrequently is it sort of a larger feature that we might have had as a ticket or a roadmap item that somebody has chosen to pick up and implement on their time. Mm-hmm. I think all three of those had very different kind of considerations for how you either encourage that or manage that.
I mean, you could potentially turn your users into contributors. Again, like sort of like, say you've written a module that's meant for beginners and you're getting email that like, I tried this thing and it didn't work, or, maybe you could help them out, but then you could actually encourage them to contribute. Like, so now they're part of it. Maybe they're going to try to tell other people about the module, and now your docs or your examples are better. And maybe you find like, oh, I need to, you need to do a thing to the code, but maybe there's an opportunity to turn the people that are asking you questions into contributors, and because I think it should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Like your project is more than the code, right? Like the documentation is like super important. If you want people to actually use it, and if you want people to contribute to it, like it being accessible. Is this right for me? How do I use it? Right? What do I do if it's behaving unexpectedly? Like those are the things I think that truly mark a success, will help get your project off the ground.
As an individual contributor, I've noticed something that's I think kind of interesting. A lot of projects do have guidelines, like contribution guidelines. GitHub has even a nice little UI for how to get involved, and you can put stuff in templates and things like that. But coming into a project and like looking at it for the first time, the ones that I feel most like getting involved with are either ones, like you said, something breaks and I want to go fix it, or they're ones that make it welcoming. Like in their README, right up front, they say, "Hey, these are some of the things we would love for you to help out with." How do you? I mean, anybody? How do you suggest encouraging people to get involved rather than just saying, "If you want to get involved, there's docs over there."
I would say like something like Slack or something like that. Maybe I would ground this in sort of like, how do you know if anybody's even using your thing, right? Because you won't have a community won't arise around your project if no one uses it but you. And so maybe the first thing is how do you encourage how do you raise awareness that this thing works, and how will you find out if people are using it? The largest open source project I ever maintained, I'm pretty sure this is where I did this, but it was like, this is in the early days when you kind of had to explain open source to people, but you just say like, just send me an email. Just say, hey, thanks. Just say I use it. Just tell me you use it. There's even something even like very early internet days was postcardware. It's like the license term was just like, send me a postcard, right? And I got a few, which is pretty cool, right? But
I remember seeing some projects where they would take pictures and they like have a wall of all their postcards.
Yeah. But
we should revive that idea. That was fun.
But then you have an indication that people are actually using this, and then maybe you could try to find out who are they, or maybe turn them into contributors, or get feedback or whatever. Like I would start there have it mesh with raising awareness that this thing even exists, right? Because there's 8 billion projects on GitHub. I don't even know what the number is, but it's probably very large.
Ben, you already mentioned, one way of doing that is to at least have a billboard at the front on the front lawn that says, if you want to get involved, here's a basic idea of how. But the key bit is that engagement thing, I think.
Yeah.
And the postcard is one way of doing that. And I think the way, back when Luke was around, he used to tell stories about how Puppet got started. And you're right, it was one person, Luke, doing this thing for a long time. But the way that open source project became more well known was he spent a lot of time on messaging boards, a lot of time on IRC, a lot of time engaging people. It wasn't about the tool or the technology; it was about talking to people and getting people to kind of form a community back. It's being approachable, engaged,
and valuing what people contribute. I was talking with Tim Musel of the Fox Group Live project about this a little bit ago. And one of the things that he's working on is trying to try and socialize the idea that, hey, if all you do is help me write a few lines in the README, that's really helpful. And because a lot of people have this like barrier to entry. They think that it's really hard to get involved. They think, oh, I don't know Ruby, I can't do that. Or I don't know Puppet, I can't do that. But even if all you do is fix a little bit of grammar to make a sentence more understandable in the README, that's a really, really valuable thing.
And it's gratifying on the side of the person receiving that PR. It's like, this is an easy merge. You're thankful, and your project's a little bit better.
Right? And we're talking. You say PR, but probably the entry point is probably more like for somebody like you said, Ben, who doesn't necessarily know Ruby, or isn't even necessarily interested in updating a README, initial engagement might just be a conversation asking for help on, say, Slack,
right?
And then somebody spending enough time to talk to that user to understand what their problem is and make that, like, as a user, if I go on Slack and talk about a problem and I'm approached by a developer and they say, oh, hey, what are you seeing? How does this work? And we have a few back and forth to the point where they understand the problem. I feel like I'm contributing at that point. And that makes me more likely to contribute something bigger in the future, whether it's a PR to a README or a bug fix or something like that.
And it might be, depending on the case, it might be worth asking. If you have that interaction with someone, you should ask them, you should write a blog post about this. Some people have more of a personal brand than others, but for a lot of people, like they enjoy blogging, or they They're known for it, but sometimes you're just like, what the heck do I write about? Like, there's people in the puppet community that are they're not prolific bloggers, but they're regular about it. Like you expect they write great blog posts, and you're happy when they do it. But maybe they hadn't considered writing a blog post about that, and maybe they would be. Or it's somebody who writes infrequently, but they haven't done it in a while, mostly because the inspiration doesn't struck them. Just write up your experience. Walk through from start to finish what you did with the thing, and you both socialize it. And everybody's a little bit better off.
If you try and engage with the project community, either by submitting a pull request or by asking for questions on something like Slack, and you get no response for a long period of time, that's the easiest way not to contribute more.
Yeah.
That never happens.
No,
I know what
that
you're
never
talking
happens.
about. So interesting thing here is that nominally we came here to talk about project management. And it seems like we very quickly segued into talking about something else entirely. But I don't think that that's true. I think that really, when you come down to it, project management is all about knowing people, talking to people, engaging with people, understanding the people who are going to be using your project, and then designing for that. Is that something that you would agree with?
I think so. I mean, that's one way of looking at product management, right? It's about how do you pick a problem and an audience that needs to be served. You need to know what to build. You need to know how to reach people. You need to get their feedback to correct your course because you're probably wrong about things large and small all along the way. But and how do you shepherd that thing through its life cycle? Right? That's one way of looking. It's like what is product management?
So project management is understanding the people who are going to be using your project and writing something that can help them do their job.
Yep. And letting them know that it exists. You could have the perfect solution, but if no one knows, they're never going to find it.
I think that kind of sums up what we were here to talk about today.
Go forth and manage your product.
All right. Thanks a lot for showing up.
Thanks.